When Arthur Ford first began hearing voices from the dead, he thought he was losing his mind. The whispers came without warning, calm, clear, insistent. He tried to ignore them, to explain them away. But the voices didn't vanish. They grew stronger, more precise, more purposeful. Over time, Ford realized that what he was experiencing wasn't madness, it was connection. He was communicating with souls who had crossed into the next world, and they had things to say. Messages of comfort, warnings, descriptions of what came after death. What he heard changed the course of his life, and challenged everything we think we know about the soul. Today, we'll dive deep into the revelations Ford received from beyond the veil. And what's most astonishing is this. The afterlife he described is almost identical to what near-death experiencers, mystics, and spiritual researchers around the world have been reporting for decades. The question is no longer whether the soul speaks. Arthur Ford was never meant to be a voice for the dead. Born in 1896 in Rogers, Kentucky, into a conservative Christian household, he was raised with the strict doctrines of the Disciples of Christ Church. His early years were filled with discipline, scripture, and a deep commitment to his faith. By all appearances, Ford was destined for a traditional path, and for a time, that's exactly the life he led. He studied theology, became a minister, and avoided any flirtation with the mystical or occult. But the trajectory of his life would change in ways no seminary could have prepared him for. The turning point came during the First World War. Ford, like many young men of his time, was swept into the chaos of battle. He witnessed unspeakable loss, including the death of one of his closest friends. That grief marked him. But something else came with it, something stranger. In the months following the loss, Ford began to feel a strange presence, as if his friend hadn't truly left. The sensation deepened into a voice, then many voices, speaking not from his mind but through it. They came with clarity, with information, with personality. They didn't feel like imagination. They felt like people. At first, Ford feared for his sanity. Raised in a world where talking to the dead was heresy, he kept silent. But the voices didn't go away. In fact, the more he resisted, the stronger they became. Over time, he began to test what they were telling him, dates, names, messages, and was startled when they turned out to be accurate. It was not a sudden transformation, but a slow, reluctant surrender to something he could no longer deny. He had become a channel between worlds. As word of his abilities spread, people began to seek him out. Grieving families came hoping for messages from lost loved ones. Skeptics came to challenge him, and often left shaken. Ford didn't put on a theatrical show. His sessions were quiet, focused, and deeply personal. He spoke softly, listened attentively, and delivered information he had no normal way of knowing. He wasn't interested in proving anything to the world. He believed his calling was to bring healing and understanding, to show people that death was not the end. Despite his growing reputation as one of the most accurate mediums of his time, Ford remained introspective and deeply spiritual. He continued to serve as a minister, integrating his mystical experiences into a broader philosophy of compassion, growth, and soul evolution. His writings reflect a man torn between two worlds, one rooted in religious tradition, the other in direct contact with something far greater than doctrine could contain. By the 1930s and 40s, Arthur Ford had become a household name in spiritualist circles. His sessions were sought by the grieving and the curious alike. But what made him truly unique was his insistence on truth. He refused to exploit his gift. He openly admitted when he could not connect or when messages were unclear. His honesty won him respect even among skeptics. Ford's most famous case, the alleged posthumous message from famed magician Harry Houdini, would thrust him into the public spotlight. But long before that headline-making moment, he had already quietly helped thousands of people find comfort in the belief that their loved ones were not gone, only changed. In time, Ford came to believe that his ability was not a curse, nor even a gift, but a responsibility. He was not speaking to spirits, he was helping them speak. And through their voices, he learned that life did not end at death, it merely crossed a threshold into something far more profound. As Arthur Ford deepened his work as a medium, he began to notice something extraordinary. Across countless sessions, in messages delivered from people of every background and belief system, The souls he communicated with described the afterlife in remarkably consistent terms. These weren't vague or symbolic images, nor were they shaped by any single religion. Instead, the descriptions formed a tapestry of recurring ideas, clear, cohesive, and profoundly human. Over and over, Ford heard that death was not an end, but a transition. The moment of passing was often described as gentle, even beautiful, like stepping out of one room and into another. Many souls reported remaining fully conscious after death, even more aware than before, as if a great fog had lifted. They spoke of feeling a sudden release from the weight of the physical body, the pain, the limitations, the fears. What replaced it was a sensation of freedom, expansion, and peace. Ford recorded that souls described the afterlife as a realm structured not by geography, but by energy, levels of vibration, or states of consciousness. A soul's environment after death, they said, reflected its inner condition. Those who lived with love, integrity, and selflessness found themselves in luminous, peaceful surroundings. Others, who were burdened by guilt, anger, or confusion, found themselves in denser, shadowy places, not as punishment, but as a mirror of their own unresolved inner state. There was no eternal damnation, no wrathful judgment, only a process of understanding and growth. The dead did not describe a heaven or hell in the traditional sense. What Ford heard again and again was that the other side was layered, composed of realms or planes corresponding to a soul's spiritual maturity. Newly departed souls often remained close to the earthly plane, especially if they were attached to loved ones or unfinished matters. As they released those ties and expanded their awareness, they moved into higher, more refined dimensions. Each step was voluntary, guided by inner readiness rather than external command. Perhaps most moving were the descriptions of life review. Many souls described experiencing a panoramic replay of their earthly life, but not as passive observers. They felt what others had felt as a result of their actions. They saw moments of kindness or cruelty from a deeper perspective, often with surprising clarity. Ford noted that this review was not about punishment or shame, but about learning. The soul, now free of ego and denial, could see its journey in full and understand what still needed to be healed or completed. Another striking element was the absence of fear. The souls that spoke through Ford never expressed horror or despair about death. Quite the opposite, they often spoke with calm, even joy. They reassured their loved ones that consciousness continued, that love endured, and that they would meet again. They urged the living not to mourn too long, not to cling to pain, but to live fully, because every thought, every act, every moment mattered in ways we cannot yet see. In his later writings, Ford reflected on how these communications had changed him. He no longer saw death as a mystery cloaked in fear, but as a natural continuation of life. He believed that the soul was eternal, evolving across lifetimes, always moving toward greater understanding and light. The dead, he said, were not gone. They were still with us, still learning, still loving, only on the other side of a very thin veil. Perhaps most astonishing was how closely these insights mirrored the accounts from other sources. Near-death experiencers, hospice nurses, Eastern mystics, and even scientific researchers exploring consciousness. Without knowing each other, without sharing cultural frameworks, they were describing the same thing. And through Arthur Ford, those voices, calm, clear, compassionate, were being heard. Arthur Ford was not content with simply relaying vague impressions or poetic messages from the beyond. He believed that if his gift was real, if he truly was in contact with the deceased, then it had to be measurable in some way. It had to be specific. It had to be verifiable. And that's exactly what he set out to prove. Unlike many so-called mediums of his time, Ford took pride in providing highly detailed personal information, facts that were unknown to him, but known to the person sitting across from him. Again and again, he delivered names, dates, private jokes, and emotional truths that struck with undeniable accuracy. Ford didn't offer generalities. He spoke of childhood nicknames, unfinished conversations, and long-forgotten phrases, things that only the deceased and their closest loved ones would know. Often his clients were left stunned, tearful, or silent in disbelief. Skeptics came to debunk him and left bewildered by the depth of his insight. His work was not about performance, it was about precision. He approached each session with solemnity, as if acting as a translator between two realms. The most famous case in Ford's career, and perhaps one of the most controversial in the history of spiritualism, involved the legendary escape artist and magician Harry Houdini. Before his death in 1926, Houdini had publicly challenged the idea of communication with the dead, exposing fraudulent mediums and daring them to prove their authenticity. But in private, he made a pact with his wife, Bess Houdini. If he could communicate after death, he would do so by delivering a secret code, a phrase known only to the two of them. The code was never revealed publicly, and Bess held seances for years without success. Then in 1929, Bess Houdini met with Arthur Ford. During their session, Ford claimed to receive a message from Houdini. To the astonishment of many, he delivered the exact code, a sequence of 10 words that had been prearranged between Harry and Bess. The words were drawn from a phrase and translated using a specific word substitution cipher. According to Bess, Ford recited them perfectly. For a time, she publicly confirmed that her husband had spoken through Ford, saying, "There is no doubt in my heart that the message given to me through Arthur Ford was the message my husband and I agreed upon before his death." The story made headlines around the world. It sparked a firestorm of interest, debate, and, as expected, skepticism. Some critics argued that Ford might have somehow discovered the code through other means, though no credible evidence was ever presented to prove that. In the years that followed, Bess distanced herself from the spiritualist community, likely due to pressure and fatigue from the endless scrutiny. But the moment stood as a milestone in the history of mediumship, a moment when a message from the dead seemed to breach the wall of the impossible. Beyond the Houdini episode, Ford's accuracy was routinely documented. In private sessions, he often revealed facts that had never been written down: the name of a pet, the location of a hidden letter, the precise wording of a last goodbye. In some cases, family members confirmed these details only after searching through old belongings or recalling conversations they had nearly forgotten. Ford kept records, and in later years, researchers such as Ruth Montgomery and others helped publish accounts that were carefully corroborated. It is important to understand that Ford did not claim infallibility. He openly acknowledged that not every session produced results, and that sometimes the signal from the other side was unclear. But when the connection did happen, when the message came through, the evidence could be chillingly accurate. For Arthur Ford, mediumship was not showmanship. It was a calling rooted in integrity, service, and the pursuit of truth. His goal was not to entertain, but to heal, to provide evidence that life continues, that love endures, and that the bond between souls is never truly broken. And for those who sat across from him, that evidence was often impossible to deny. As Arthur Ford continued to document the messages he received from those who had passed on, he began noticing something remarkable. The stories, visions, and descriptions shared by the departed aligned with accounts from completely unrelated sources. These weren't people who knew each other or followed the same traditions. In many cases, they had never heard of Arthur Ford. And yet the core elements of their experiences were strikingly similar. These parallels would become one of the most powerful arguments for the credibility of life after death. In the 1960s and 70s, psychiatrist Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross began studying the emotional and spiritual experiences of the dying. Her work, including the best-selling book on death and dying, revealed that many terminal patients reported seeing light, feeling deep peace, and even being greeted by deceased relatives. Her later writings included accounts of people who had clinically died and returned, describing a place beyond time, filled with unconditional love and radiant beings. These stories echoed almost word for word what Ford had been hearing for decades through his mediumship. Then came Dr. Raymond Moody, whose book, Life After Life in 1975, introduced the world to the term near-death experience, NDE. He documented hundreds of cases where people described leaving their bodies, floating above themselves, passing through a tunnel, encountering a being of light, and experiencing a life review. These individuals, from all backgrounds and belief systems, spoke of an overwhelming sense of love and understanding on the other side. Again, the themes aligned perfectly with the spirit messages Ford had been receiving. especially the review of one's life through the eyes of others and the absence of judgment. In the 1990s and 2000s, Dr. Michael Newton, a hypnotherapist, began regressing clients not only into past lives, but into the between-life states, the periods between incarnations. What he uncovered through thousands of deep trance sessions was a spiritual dimension where souls gathered, studied, rested, and prepared for new lives. Newton's subjects described spirit guides, soul families, and a hierarchy of learning and development. These recollections, uncovered without prompting, reinforced the structure Ford had spoken of. Levels of spiritual progression, meetings with advanced souls, and a continued journey beyond death. Even going back further in time, the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, the 18th century Swedish scientist and mystic, mirrored Ford's messages. Swedenborg claimed to have experienced direct visions of the afterlife and described realms filled with light, love, and truth, where souls were drawn to places that matched their inner nature. His descriptions of spiritual correspondences, soul communities, and non-physical landscapes were eerily similar to the reports Ford received in the 20th century. Across all these sources, certain common denominators appear again and again. Regardless of culture, language, religion, or time period, there is often a moment of separation from the body, described as floating or rising. Many speak of a tunnel or gateway, a being of light or familiar presence, and an overwhelming feeling of unconditional acceptance. The life review appears again and again, as does the presence of spiritual guides or teachers, whose role is to help the soul reflect and grow. None of these elements come from folklore or fiction. They arise spontaneously, across thousands of testimonies, including those Arthur Ford collected through direct mediumship. What makes these consistencies so powerful is the fact that they come from people who never met, never read the same books, and in some cases, were children too young to be influenced by outside ideas. And yet they describe the same luminous landscape, one where love is the binding force, where knowledge is limitless, and where life, in all its forms, continues. For Ford, these parallels were not coincidence. They were confirmation. He believed that the spirit world was real, not a fantasy or metaphor, and that those who returned from death or communicated across the veil were offering us glimpses of that reality. The unity in their messages suggests that we're not dealing with hallucination or imagination, but with truth. And perhaps the most profound realization is this: if so many voices are describing the same afterlife, then maybe they're not all imagining it. Maybe they're remembering. The legacy of Arthur Ford is not simply one of spiritual curiosity or psychic ability. It is a legacy of deep comfort, courageous inquiry, and unwavering belief in the continuity of life. Through thousands of documented cases and messages from the beyond, Ford offered more than mystical insight. He offered a map, a way to understand death not as an ending, but as a passage into a larger story. A story where love does not die, where the soul continues its growth, and where consciousness proves to be greater than the body that once contained it. At a time when death is often spoken of in hushed tones or cloaked in fear, Ford's work reminds us that there is nothing to fear. His revelations were not rooted in dogma or doctrine. They did not come from ancient texts or rigid beliefs. They came from voices, clear, consistent, and filled with humanity. Voices that spoke of freedom, of understanding, and above all, of continuity. For those who had lost loved ones, Ford's messages became lifelines. They brought tears, yes, but also healing. Because to know that someone is not gone forever, but waiting, watching, and still loving you from another plane, that changes everything. Ford once said, "We do not live only once, and we never lose each other forever." This belief was not poetic metaphor for him. It was the truth, as conveyed to him by the countless souls who crossed the threshold and reached back to speak. These souls didn't describe a cold, sterile afterlife. They described beauty, learning, reunion, and purpose. They described continuing existence, one not chained to grief or pain, but expanding with joy, awareness, and light. In our modern world, where scientific materialism still struggles to explain the nature of consciousness, Ford's work stands as a quiet but powerful challenge. If death is not the end, then life must be redefined. If the soul is real, as his evidence suggests, then every moment we live, every decision we make, carries eternal significance. The implications are vast. It forces us to reflect. What are we doing with our lives? Who are we becoming, not just here, but beyond? More than half a century after his most active years, Arthur Ford's words still resonate. In an age of doubt, they offer faith without dogma. In a time of loss, they offer connection without illusion. And in the face of mortality, they offer a profound alternative to fear. The idea that we are not our bodies, that death is not darkness, and that love, the truest force in the universe, is the thread that connects all souls forever. Perhaps that's why his revelations matter so deeply today. Not because they answer every question, but because they ask us to live as if our souls matter. To forgive, to love, to grow, to become the kind of beings we would want to meet again in whatever world comes next. Arthur Ford didn't try to prove life after death with equations or dogmas. He simply listened, and what he heard continues to inspire people around the world to this day. To listen more deeply, to live more fully, and to trust that the soul never stops speaking. Do you believe in the rebirth of souls? Write in the comments. Dear friends, if you like this video, please like it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you soon.